Okay, Prebendary Miller, or Edward Miller. Dr. Ince and gentlemen, I think that the attempt to combine scholars upon a general study of the text of Holy Scriptures has been rather lost sight of during late years, although it cannot be doubted for a moment that the study is very important, and indeed the interest of it is as wide as Christendom. The system which is now in vogue, I allude of course to that of Dr. Hort, is, I find, looked upon with invincible repugnance by a very large number of scholars. And, speaking very briefly, I have reason to suppose that even those who hold and teach it feel some misgivings, and are not inclined to press it to the extreme extent that Dr. Hort did. Turning, therefore, to the other system, which I have had the honor of presenting recently to the learned world, I wish to point out in general terms the chief characteristics of it. Dean Bergen's principles, which I advocate, have been, I think, very much misunderstood, and as the chairman has just said, I think there were reasons, certainly, of a personal character which led people to attribute undue importance to some parts of them, and generally not to understand them in their proper proportions. This, however, should be borne in mind, that Dean Bergen threw his whole intellect and powers and devoted a very great number of years in the latter part of his life to this work. And in order to do so, he looked at the question all around. He took the advice of some of the ablest men in the country, and then produced a system which at any rate must be said to be large-minded, even if unsound, but the large-mindedness and the soundness of it, perhaps, I may be permitted to say, was, as far as I was able to judge, that which attracted myself. The chief principle of it is this, which I will state in the words of Dr. Scrivener, whose caution and care, I think, can hardly be doubted. He says, one thing would appear at first sight almost too clear for argument, too self-evident to be disputed, that it is both our wisdom and our duty to weigh the momentous subject at issue in all its parts, shutting out from the mind no source of information which can reasonably be supposed capable of influencing our decision. The plain English of which is this, that Dr. Scrivener advocated a view which was supported by the large mass of manuscripts against the few. He estimated the vast mass of those manuscripts and other evidence which have been discovered and are known as 19/20ths, and he asks how it can be that 1/20th shall be supposed to override the verdict of all the rest. Now it is just possible there may be some here who would like to have this exhibited in, say, 2 instances. Perhaps those of the rest who are familiar with them will pardon me if I bring them before the meeting. I will take first the case of the one in the first chapter of St. Matthew, verse 25, the question of the word, prototokon. You remember it is rejected by some, but it is maintained in what we call the traditional text. With regard to the evidence for the maintenance of it, I should like to say that I do not quote Tischendorf entirely by himself. Perhaps I may be permitted to say that I am engaged in preparing a commentary which is intended to go on all the main passages considerably beyond Tischendorf, and I have finished the first 10 chapters of St. Matthew, from which both these instances have been taken. The evidence then is as follows. For the word, firstborn, the following uncial manuscripts, C, sigma, D, E, K, L, M, S, U, V, gamma, delta, pi, 13, all collated cursives except 2, The Old Latin manuscripts F, FF1, G1, Q, Vulgate, Pashto-Harklian, Ethiopic, Armenian, Georgian, Slavonic, Tatian, Athanasius II, Pseudo-Athanasius, Didymus, Cyril of Jerusalem, Basil, 3, Gregory of Nyssa, Ephraim, Cyrus, Epiphanius, 3, Chrysostom, Proclus, Isidore of Pelusium, John Damascene, Photius, Nicetas, Ambrose, Opus Imperfectum, Augustine, I believe, Jerome. For the omission of this word, we have only Aleph, the Sinaitic, B, the Vatican, Z, the Dublin palimpsest, i.e. 3 uncials, the 2 cursives, 1 and 33, the Old Latin, A, B, C, G1, K, Bohairic, Curetonian, Lewis, of the Fathers, Ambrose, 3. Now it is quite possible that there may be more of the Fathers for this omission, which I think is very probable. Perhaps I may say that I am only beginning my work. Some weeks ago I went into the Bodleian with a number of passages, 1,800, which I had taken from Dean Burgin's indexes to the quotations in the Fathers, to search out. These did not by any means exhaust the whole of the quotations occurring in the 10 chapters, and as I have not been able to finish the investigation, I cannot say whether there are any more on the other side. It is very probable there are some, but I think only a few. Accordingly, this instance will illustrate what is very commonly the case: the difference between the mass of manuscripts on the one side and the very few on the other. My second instance is, I think, a very interesting one. We all remember Professor Huxley's paper in the 19th century about the devils going into the swine, in which he quoted St. Matthew chapter 8, verse 31 as, "Send us into the herd of swine." It is a pity that he did not prefer the reading, "Suffer us to go," which is much the softer of the two and takes off from the harshness of the other. But of course, we must proceed upon evidence. Dean Burgin always maintained that it was not a question of opinion, but a question of actual evidence which should rule us. Now, is witnessed to by C. Phi at the end of the 5th century, EKLM SUVX delta pi, 12 uncials, nearly all collated cursives, the Old Latin FHQ Pashto-Harklian, while sigma at the beginning of the 9th century reads, which is practically the same, and the variations of one cursive which reads, and of 6 which omit, altogether, do not prevent them from being reckoned as supporters of the rest. On the other hand, for only 2 uncial manuscripts, B, Aleph, can be reckoned, only 4 cursives to follow Tischendorf, for my work here is not complete, 122, 33, 118, with the versions A, B, C, D, FF1, G1, KL, Vulgate, Bohairic, Sahidic, Ethiopic, Arabic. That will show what will be perfectly familiar to those who have looked thoroughly into these questions. The extreme difference there is between the 2 contentions. The remarkable thing is that the extreme difference is kept up to a very great extent, indeed throughout the Gospels. In almost all controverted cases, you will find, and this is a misfortune, Aleph and B, or one of them, with a very small body on one side and a large body of other manuscripts on the other. I say that is a misfortune because I think it is that which divides us into two camps, a thing I very much regret. This being so, if you have a very small body of manuscripts against all the others, how can it possibly be right to say that the small body should dominate all the rest? Just look at the matter for an instant in this way. Suppose you are sitting at the elbow of an editor of Agamemnon, or the Trachinae, or whatever it may be of Sophocles. You would see that in his very wildest dreams he would never conceive of any difficult passage of such an immense mass of evidence being at hand, as we have in this case on the one side, set aside by those few. And yet when one looks at Dr. Hort's system, one finds a large body of evidence frequently thrown entirely aside and virtually cast into the wastepaper basket. I will ask, is that a logical or a proper way of proceeding? Can it be justified intellectually, and can it be right in dealing with Holy Scripture? The explanation is what has frequently been called by other men the extreme adulation paid to B, especially by Dr. Hort and men of that side. I think some of it is very natural, and that history quite accounts for it. They are the two oldest manuscripts, and in early times, when people had in their view only a small amount of evidence, it was very natural that they should say that these two manuscripts, which come to us as the earliest, and were therefore nearest to the original autographs, should be right. A great deal of interest was also felt because B, in the Vatican, was invested with a certain amount of mystery. People were in the habit of looking for great things to come from Rome, and being unable to learn what it was which was so zealously guarded, they thought it would prove to be the key to all the difficulties when it was discovered. Thus, when another manuscript like Aleph was found by Tischendorf, it was only reasonable that great attention should be paid to it. Yet when we look on the other side, there are certain points which cast discredit upon those two documents. In the first place, according to all the critics, they were produced in those times after the Council of Nicaea, when semi-Arianism, or one of those kinds of belief which were associated with it, were in the ascendant. And it was very remarkable that just at the time when the Nicene Creed was finally accepted, towards the end of the century, these manuscripts seem to have slipped out of repute. Then also they bear, I think, upon them traces of a somewhat skeptical tone, sometimes almost going into heresy, which would enable one, as I think, to connect them with the period in which they were produced. They are two incomplete manuscripts. There are no breathings or accents and scarcely any stops in B. And there are no breathings or accents except in two passages in Aleph, and the stops are very fitful and uncertain. These manuscripts were also, as I have pointed out, condemned within 50 years. There was, I think, a great deal involved in that circumstance. And lastly, they are rejected by evidence virtually older than themselves. Objection was made to Dean Bergen that he did not care for the value of manuscripts. This is quite untrue, as far as feelings were concerned. Although, of course, you must not simply depend upon what a man's feelings are to maintain anything respecting his actions. All right, we will continue with defending Dean Bergen's approach, in Lord willing, in the next video.